Hi there. So a little bit of a different background for y'all to kind of mix things up. Um, so industry and infrastructure is what we're going to be talking about today. We've been focusing a lot on how identity and questions of users and questions of hardware and the device itself and its history have kind of come to bear on media experience. But there's another element here that has to do with how devices are situated in an industry context and an infrastructural context. And these mark a kind of a turning away from content of media to its materiality and its distribution. So we've concentrated a lot on the materiality of devices to date, that's true, but not so much on the aspect of their distribution throughout the world. And one example of a system of distribution is the Google data center located in Finland. So Google has huge collections of server farms across the globe, depending on where it's cheapest to operate. One advantage of Finland, for example, is that the temperature makes cooling systems cheap or less important to install, because huge server farms generate a huge amount of heat and they're usually cooled by water systems. So these systems of distribution have huge scales, and it's important to realize that all of our stuff that we view and that we view as being sort of virtual is in fact anchored to physical logistics that include material realities like cooling systems, the human labor needed to maintain them, questions of geography and setting up sort of media infrastructures over kind of geographic terrain. Lisa Parks, one of the main people to sort of start infrastructure studies, began by studying the history of satellite networks, and her political kind of project, or why she wanted to do this, and the reason why she's interested in these topics is that she says that the privatization of media companies in recent years, meaning that many of these systems are not overseen by the government or public anymore, that this sort of transition has led to a lack of transparency and accountability to the public. And the more people understand the realities and contingencies of infrastructure, then the more politically aware that we can become. So examples of subjects that infrastructure people are into are things like regulation, distribution, the political economy of media companies, telephone wires and where they are at, underwater cables, satellites, environmental costs associated with all of these. So they're interested in answering questions like, why is Australia's internet so slow? Which the answer is a combination of politics, industry, and infrastructure for why it's slower than other countries. Harold Innis is kind of the father of infrastructural studies, and he talks about time-based and space-based infrastructure. So media infrastructures favor time, like monuments, like stone is an infrastructure that favors time and wants to endure for a long time. And space-based infrastructures favor dynamics like spanning space, like maybe the earliest example of this is paper, because you could send it to people. So that's another way of thinking about infrastructural studies is my medium time-based or space-based in terms of its infrastructure. Grant Balmer says that the vagueness of terms like the cloud lead us to believe that our information and content exists somewhere up there in an abstract kind of miasma, when in fact these are reducible to a tangle of wires and servers, and the immense material realities required to house all of our flows of information have direct effects on the content that we consume. Some of these material systems include telephone wires, internet cables, radio towers. He says that infrastructure is the material network that gives shape to and determines our media in ways that produce relationships of power. So the companies behind and governments behind infrastructural systems, that's a power relationship with the consumer that we have to sort of be mindful of and question. Infrastructure can also include things like coding. So computers can only communicate with each other through sort of agreed upon standards, some of which you might have heard of, like HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol, SMTP or Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, FTP, File Transfer Protocol, or TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. So HTTP is used for accessing and sending data for websites. SMTP is used for sending email. FTP is used for sending files, and IP is for making a connection to the internet. So some scholars believe these protocol systems are the primary way the internet controls and manages not only information, but the users as well. So we're kind of confined to a set of systems and rules that we might not even be aware of necessarily, that is a part of, the devices that you're inventing at the moment have to exist within an existing infrastructure or within an infrastructure that you kind of create. So these infrastructures shape what we can say, how we can act via digital media. They create a hierarchy of control of the management and deployment of protocol. Infrastructure might also include things like power grids, roads, mass transit systems that might influence the way that we use media. One example of this was getting my internet installed in Australia, which is infamously terrible and awful, and you have to go through so many different systems in order to do it. And in order to get internet installed into my apartment here, I had to, contact the internet provider, send me the modem, and sort of set up the connection. But in order to set up the connection to my unit, I needed to hire a separate electrician to jump the MDF cable from the road to the apartment complex. So all of these sort of hoops I was having to jump through, and it's a total racket. They charge $200 for an MDF jump, which is basically like someone being like, it was really annoying, right? But this is an example of the infrastructure sort of networks I had to go through in order to have access to the internet and to my job, because the internet is still not seen like water. It's not seen as a public utility. So it is subject to privatized infrastructural kind of dynamics. Other aspects are roped into the study of infrastructures as well. Because the internet is so reliant on cables, it is reliant on geography, and thus is under partial government control and partial private control, because a lot of parties need to interact in order to set up these cables and where they need to be. Another example of infrastructural studies would include the contact between governments and media conglomerates in terms of the question of media internet neutrality. So because media companies have converged and have sort of become ever more sort of huge and big umbrellas that sort of have ownership of a lot of different sort of media companies, many internet providers are also buying up sort of content production companies as well. So the thorny question comes here about, should Telstra be able to slow your access to Netflix if they want you to consume their media platform instead? And that becomes a real kind of question that affects users and that might be subject to government regulation. It's a big kind of deal. Other examples show how infrastructural decisions embed social ideologies. For example, the New York to Long Island road. So like in New York, Long Island is a ways away, right? It's kind of like in the outer rim of New York. So the New York to Long Island road had an overpass that was purposely made low in order to discourage buses coming through because they didn't want lower income people going to New Island, to Long Island. So that's an example of how some infrastructural decisions actually have sort of political purpose and sort of not always the best political purpose. So infrastructure can have far-reaching effects, even to the criminal justice system. So I don't know if some of you are big Serial fans, but the first season of the Serial podcast reopened a cold case of a young man accused of murdering his girlfriend. And the main way they did that was by linking together cell phone pings using towers in order to cast enough skepticism about the kind of timing of where he was in relationship to the body and to the events to reopen the case. Another area of interest in infrastructure is media and climate change. And I'm sure some of you are, if you are in these sort of social justice sort of courses at UQ right now, you'll be investigating this. But one example is e-readers actually have more environmental damage than printed books on recycled paper due to the number of gallons of water that e-readers demand to be made. So it's sort of like almond milk. Like you think that you're kind of drinking something that's non-dairy and that's good for the environment. But in fact, the kind of huge amount of resources to make almond milk actually kind of make drinking dairy or soy milk a better option. So you need you need to have read sort of 100 ebook stories in order to counterset the costs of the making of that e-reader. And if you think about the sort of the kind of times or the sort of duration of e-readers in terms of their operation, I've rarely had one that didn't last past a year. Then this becomes kind of an issue, right? So climate-sensitive infrastructural studies considers the energy expended of sending something like an unnecessary email. It considers the e-waste that is imported into developing countries who are left with piles of our discarded phones and their toxic components. So yeah, I've covered sort of broadly in this video the sort of concerns and topics of infrastructure studies. And the dog is kind of like walking around the background, which is why you might have heard like clicking noises because his nails are on hardwood floors. So just, be mindful that's what that is. All right, I'll see you in the next video.